So thank you again for joining. Again, my name is Sam Furio. If you haven't joined one of our previous informational sessions, you are able to view the recordings of our previous informational sessions on the BEPS YouTube playlist. This session is being recorded, and so if you miss anything during today's session, we will be uploading it to YouTube as well, and we'll send out an email once it's available on YouTube, along with any necessary materials. Materials that are distributed during each session will be uploaded in the video description of the on YouTube playlist. So lose track of any links or anything, you can find them there shortly. So today we're going to discuss the exemption process for individually designated historic buildings for Maryland's Building Energy Performance Standards. And today we have Elizabeth Hughes with the Maryland Historical Trust and Dr. Zach Brizola from the Maryland Department of Environment Building Decarbonization Team to talk through the historic exemption and also give an overview on Maryland Historical Trust. So, and just a run of show or some points if you haven't joined these informational sessions before. The chat has been disabled. If you need to ask a question, there is a Q&A feature in this Google Meet that is in the Activities button, which is in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. It is a circle, triangle, square. You click on that button and you can get to the Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, feel free to submit your thoughts in there, and we will work to get to them at the end of the presentation as time allows. And if we don't get to your question during today's session, we'll work to address them in future sessions. So before diving in, if you require an overview of BEPS, and we will be providing a brief overview today, but if you require a more in-depth overview, we'd recommend tuning into the BEPS website, which you can get to via the QR code on the left side of the screen. And if you are looking to get updates on the regulation, you can sign up for the BEPS communications list, which is you can access via the QR code on the right side of the screen. And again, Zach and I work with the Building Decarbonization Team. If you have any questions for us regarding BEPS, you can email us at beps.mde@maryland.gov or give us a call at 410-537-3183. So a little bit purpose for this working group. So this is the Historic Property Working Group for the Building Energy Performance Standards. And so this working group is being hosted to review the BEPS historic exemption language and eligibility for that exemption. And we also have two goals for this working group. Goal one is to release draft guidance for this historic property exemption process, and also release guidance on supporting documentation that will need to be provided to be granted the exemption. And then goal two is more of a longer term goal. We'll be working on achieving this goal throughout 2025, but that is developing energy performance improvement recommendations for all historic properties, regardless of whether they meet the eligibility for a BEPS exemption or not. And so that energy performance improvement document would be drafted as part of the working group and uploaded to the Clean Buildings Hub, which is being developed within the Maryland Energy Administration, which is going to be a resource to provide first mile technical assistance to building owners in the state of Maryland to assist in decarbonization. And so finally, finalizing these guidance documents that I just mentioned. So an agenda for this first session, we're going to provide a BEPS overview. we're going to discuss the historic exemption language that's in the regulation. We're going to discuss the historic designations, being federal, state, and local. The exemption process for BEPS, how do you submit an exemption application, and we're going to review those applicable forms for historic exemptions. And then we're going to release a feedback form to you all today, and we'd really appreciate if you could provide your feedback on available exemption forms. And then also, as I said, as time allows, we're going to have Q&A for today. So just before I pass it to Dr. Zach Brazola, I'm going to provide an overview of BEPS for those of you that are just hearing about the regulation. If you're just hearing about it, you're not behind the times at all. We're going to walk you through today on some of the key points. And if you're, as I said, if you require more in-depth details, you can view previous recordings on the BEPS YouTube playlist. So the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022 required the Maryland Department of the Environment to implement building energy performance standards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from Maryland's large building sector. And implementing BEPS is a crucial step in meeting the state's ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals, which are a 60% reduction in statewide emissions by 2031 and achieving net zero emissions by 2045. So the department was required to implement BEPS to assist in this, in meeting the state's goals. And we were also required to exempt certain property types from BEPS. And so that is a main reason why we're hosting this working group, is to discuss the required exemption for individually designated historic buildings and spaces. So if you're interested in reading about the state's pathway towards meeting its climate goals, you can read the Climate Pollution Reduction Plan on MDE's website today. So high-level overview of BEPS. As I said, BEPS aims to reduce emissions from large buildings in the state of Maryland. And it also aims to reduce energy costs for building owners, as well as improving indoor and outdoor air quality for Marylanders. So I said that BEPS applies to large buildings in the state of Maryland. Those large buildings are buildings greater than 35,000 square feet, excluding any parking garage area. So those buildings that meet that size threshold are deemed covered buildings. That means they have to comply with the regulation. So covered buildings, as part of the requirements for this regulation, must annually report energy consumption beginning next year in 2025. So the first reports are due June 1, 2025, so under 6 months from now. For 5 years and annually thereafter, building owners will need to report their calendar year energy use for their buildings to MDE. And then in 2030, they need to start meeting phased emission standards. As I said, we're working to meet the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so starting in 2030, building owners also have the option of choosing to make an alternative compliance payment for their building's excess emissions over the standards. So where are we in the regulatory adoption timeline? Or in the regulatory adoption process. So as I said, Climate Solutions Now required MDE to implement BEPS in 2022. Well, just about 2.5 years later, we proposed a version of the BEPS regulation on September 6th, held a public comment period and hearing in October. And recently on December 13th, the notice of final action for BEPS was printed in the Maryland Register, and the regulation is final effective on December 23rd, 2024. So these first requirements for building owners, as I previously said, is the reporting of their calendar year 2024 energy use data to MDE by June 1, 2025. So what do covered buildings look like in the state of Maryland? What does 35,000 square feet look like? So based on a preliminary analysis underlying the regulation, the department found over 9,000 buildings in the state that meet this size threshold of being greater than 35,000 square feet. And so of those 9,000 buildings, you can see how they land in terms of property types throughout the state. So the majority of those 9,000 buildings are warehouses, office spaces, multifamily housing, and retail stores. And based on the same analysis, we are able to locate where these buildings are throughout the state, and each county in Maryland has covered buildings, but as you can see, the majority of them are located between Baltimore and DC along the I-95 corridor. So as I said, the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022 required us to exempt certain property types from BEPS. And so on the screen, we have the different types of exemptions that are within the regulation. And so I'm just going to walk you through these different types of exemptions, but obviously today we're focusing on the historic exemption. So we're going to dive into that more so after this. But so there are buildings that are available for total exemption from the regulation. They need to apply for this exemption and be determined that they are eligible for it. Those are buildings that, what you're all here for, buildings individually designated as historic by federal, state, or local law, elementary and secondary schools, manufacturing buildings, agricultural buildings, demolished buildings, and federally owned buildings. So those are totally exempt from the regulation, but they still need to apply. There's also exemptions for reduced alternative compliance payments for affordable housing providers, which is also available for naturally occurring affordable housing providers, and providers that meet the eligibility for this exemption must apply annually, but they are eligible for a reduced alternative compliance payment for any excess emissions. There's a total exemption available for buildings in financial distress or that have no occupancy, and so they're able to apply annually for that exemption. And there's also an exemption to push off establishing baseline energy performance for your building if you're under 50% occupancy or you're low occupancy. And you are able to apply for that annually, but you're only able to apply for that 3 times. So where do owners of covered buildings need to go, and how do they get started? So as I said, June 1st, 2025 is the first requirements for building owners, and that's reporting. On June 1, 2025, building owners will need to report their 2024 calendar year energy use data. So annually, starting in 2025, building owners are going to use Energy Star Portfolio Manager. That's the building's chosen benchmarking tool, or the department's chosen benchmarking tool, to track annual energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. Annually, starting next year, building owners are going to determine if changes are needed to achieve the standards in the regulation. And then 5 years down the road, building owners will need to start achieving the performance standards annually starting in 2030. And they can either achieve the standards or achieve partial compliance with them and make that alternative compliance payment I mentioned for their building's excess emissions over their standards. So just a little bit more information on the performance standards portion of building energy performance standards. We like to say building owners have a long runway. There's 5 years where building owners are just reporting energy use data to the department. So there's no performance standards requirements for the first 5 years. In 2030, the performance standards come into effect, and they take shape as a phased reduction of on-site direct emissions by the type of building. And I say phased reduction because, again, we're working to get buildings to achieve emissions reductions to meet the state's goals of net zero by 2045. And so the emissions reductions for buildings is 3-phased. Starts in interim standard 1 from 2030 to 2034. That's going to be a building's highest allotment of emissions for their property type. Interim standard 2, that emissions allotment is going to tighten, and that's from 2035 to 2039. And then the final standard for all buildings comes into effect in 2040 and beyond, and that's net zero direct emissions from the site. We model that 33% of those 9,000 buildings in the state of Maryland are already meeting the final standard of net zero direct emissions. And so it's possible that when you start benchmarking or your clients start benchmarking, you're already in compliance with that final standard, or maybe you start benchmarking and you're already in compliance with interim standard 2 or interim standard 1. And so it's possible that your runway to compliance lengthens. Additionally, the department intends to adopt an energy efficiency standard called Site Energy Use Intensity, or EUI, in 2027. And so in the meantime, when you're benchmarking and assessing your building's performance, and if you're making any upgrades, we recommend not installing inefficient electric equipment. And so with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Zach Brazola, section head of the building decarbonization team, to tell you more about this historic exemption and eligibility to be granted it. Take it away, Zach.
Thank you very much, Sam. And thank you all for joining us today. So let's get into the nitty-gritty here. The regulation says that within the definition of a covered building, a covered building includes a building that meets the criteria for a covered building as described in that section. Basically that it's over 35,000 square feet, or there's a couple of other key pieces of if it's connected with another system by a shared HVAC, another building with a shared HVAC system is the main one. But it is in a historic district, and it also includes buildings within a historic district, but that building is not individually designated as a historic property under federal, state, or local law. Now, the key thing why we're really here all today is that a covered building is defined as not including a building or a space within a building individually designated as a historic property under federal, state, or local law. And that is, again, as we reiterated above, separate and apart from its inclusion in a historic district. So let's go through what each of these mean. Federal law. That building is individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. State law, it's going to be listed on the Maryland Register of Historic Places. And then local law varies a lot more. It's individually designated by a local jurisdiction's proclamation or law. For example, your local county or city government might do this. And as we get to the feedback form later, this is where we're actually going to ask you all, what examples do you have of these different federal, state, or local laws? These are the ones that we know of. This is kind of the standard practice, but especially on the local level, if you've got some good examples of a building that you might think would meet that definition and the documentation behind it, it'd be very helpful as we start thinking about all of this or as we start evaluating this to hear what you have to say. So that's part of this feedback process, is hearing from you all about your historic buildings and how they meet that individual listing requirement. So moving along, we're going to review the actual forms. So to apply for an exemption, right? And this is all going to take place. So the regulation is kind of we're right in the middle of it, finalizing right now. The notice of final action published. It will be final effective on December 23rd. We're going to have all of our, what we're calling the BEPS portal. It's all the kind of surrounding information about BEPS and these exemption applications available in early January. So that's coming. And at that time, you'll be able to go and apply for exemption. And any bill to apply for that exemption, you must submit to the department the exemption request form and supporting documentation backing up that request. The department and the compliance team will thoroughly evaluate each exemption request. And resubmissions for exemption status may be required by the department. The applications will be up in January. So that's the kind of key thing that we want to make sure everyone's thinking about we're working towards it. You'll see when we get to the feedback form, because of the timing, we'll take a little bit more time on this historic exemption. We might make adjustments to that as we get your feedback. But the earlier you get it in towards our deadline, the better. So let's actually go through and look at what this exemption form is drafted to look like. So our draft of this, and this is, if you've been to our exemption working groups before, we've had one kind of for the broader exemptions. This is very similar. This is exactly the same. We have this pretty standard across every single form, which is contact information. So the person that is submitting the request, the information about the building itself, where it's located, and the owner of that building, because sometimes we know that there are third parties handling the benchmarking and related tasks. So this is kind of the key information on this main slide. Then if we go to the next slide, the actual the meat of this is basically stating out what we've talked about. A building owner must provide documentation showing that the covered building meets the exemption criteria as specified in the BEPS regulation. By submitting the form, you're certifying that the building meets the definition of a historic building, and that definition, taken right from the regulation, is a historic building or space within a building that must be individually designated as a historic property under federal, state, or local law, separate and apart from its inclusion in a historic district. And then we ask, is it listed on the covered buildings list? And this is a list that we have. We have a preliminary version available on the website today that you can go look. If you go to the BEPS website and scroll all the way to the bottom, it's there. But we'll also be, as part of the portal, releasing a revised version of that that's a little bit more interactive, so you can select your property. Now, that list is not necessarily comprehensive. It has been our best assessment of all the buildings in the state that are over 35,000 square feet, but we know of cases where a building is missed because the input data, which we use from the State Department of Assessment and Taxation, might be wrong, or something's changed even since that data has been put together. So there is some room on that where it might not be correct. And ultimately, there's ways to say that your buildings shouldn't be listed because it's under 35,000 square feet. Obviously, if you're an exempt building, you have a way to apply for exemption. And if your building is not listed on the list, but meets the definition of a covered building, it's over 35,000 square feet, or this kind of one or two other reasons why it might get totally the kind of square footage of the total building that you can meter is over 35,000 square feet, then your building is covered regardless of its inclusion on that list. So with that, let's keep going down the form. Actually, hop back a second, please. Thank you. Detailed description of why this qualifies as a historic property. Just providing a little bit of background along the attachments you're providing, and then provide an attachment that is designated as a historic property under federal, state, or local law. And it could include a copy of the building's listing on the National Register, et cetera, or a proclamation from your local city or county government, if that's what is doing it. So just to demystify this a little bit for everybody, because I know the regulatory language can be a little confusing. This is an example of a historic building. And when Elizabeth comes on in a minute, she's going to talk a little bit about Medusa, which is one of the tools that the Historic Trust uses. And we use that as the source for some of this. So this is the Maryland State House, list in yellow. That building individually is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So this is an example of a building that would apply and provide information that it is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and then the compliance team would review that and say, okay, if it all checks out, great, this building is exempt. And that's the end of the story for that building. There is this possibility, if you were to have a building and that was listed and it got demolished, which does happen, and something got built in its place, then we could be saying, well, actually that new building there, that building's got to kind of come back into the program if it otherwise meets the criteria. So there is this kind of thing where if the building substantially changes, it no longer meets that exemption criteria, then that exemption no longer applies. So let's go to the next example. The State House sits within downtown Annapolis, and downtown Annapolis is actually a historic district. So and you can see all these buildings outlined in red are part of the historic district in downtown Annapolis. The State House is listed separately from that historic district. So that's why the State House can apply. But all those other little red buildings, unless they are separately listed and individually listed in the state, local, in the national, state, or local as a historic building, then those buildings are not exempt. So again, just kind of providing this because I know there is some confusion here. Basically, that individual building has to be listed. It's not the district. It's not that that building sits in a district that is on as historic. So that's kind of how this would go. And then if we go to the next slide, this is an example of the building circled in red. It's a little small. This is just an example. This building probably isn't over 35,000 square feet, but say it was. If any of you have been in Annapolis, this is the bank that's got the like sails out front. It could be potentially, it's pending a determination of eligibility for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. So somebody said, I think this building is historic. They've put in an application, but they are not yet listed. So this building would not be eligible right now for application because it has not actually been said that this is historic. The owner has said, I think it might be, and they're putting in an application, but it's not there yet. So just trying to show you a little bit of the spectrum of what you might see. So again, individual listing, great. That building is eligible to apply for exemption. They can apply. If everything lines up, they're going to be exempted. If they're in a historic district but not individually listed, they're not eligible for exemption. Here, and in this case, if they are historic but they haven't yet applied for that building, or they're in the process of applying, they're not yet actually listed. They're not eligible yet. Now that could change in a year. That building could be listed, and then you would apply for exemption at that time. So that's how that would work. And so that's, really the kind of crux of what we're talking about today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth from the Department of Planning, Maryland's Historical Trust. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure. So I'm really here, I think, largely to answer any questions that may come up regarding the historic exemptions in our role. So to the extent that you have worked with us before or have not, my name's Elizabeth Hughes. I'm the director of the Maryland Historical Trust. We're a state agency, even though the name doesn't necessarily sound like one. We're embedded within the Maryland Department of Planning, and our role is as the Maryland State Historic Preservation Office. So when it comes to things like National Register listings, we're constantly in contact with the National Park Service and the keeper of the National Register when it comes to either creating new nominations, amending existing nominations. You would come to us for that listing to see if your property is already listed on the National Register of Historic Places. If you don't know that already, hopefully you know, and you're using that designation to utilize state and federal historic tax credits for rehabilitation or other financial benefits that come along with that National Register listing. Also, you would come to us when it comes to the question of this state designation as an individually eligible property, a property that is individually eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, but has not yet gone through that nomination and approval process, is a type of property we consider to be on the Maryland Register of Historic Places. Data on National Register listings, as well as on Maryland Register listings, or what we call determinations of eligibility, can be found on our GIS-based database, which we call Medusa. If you studied your Greek and Roman mythology, you remember that a creature with multiple heads. That's the way we think of Medusa. It is basically a database with lots of different fields within it. That's a way where you can determine using either the map function or an address function if the property that you own or are concerned about are in fact already listed on the National Register. Or if you want to pursue National Register nomination for a property, you would also come to us and we'll provide you that technical assistance to walk you through that process. Now on the call today, we have people like Amanda from Frederick County, or Lauren from Baltimore City, and Rebecca from Montgomery County. Those would be the folks you would go to for that local designation, a local landmark designation, a determination. The Maryland Historical Trust, as a state agency, we don't have that local government data. So we would not be able to assist you when it comes to that kind of local historic designation that's referenced as one of the designations. But those folks would be available to assist you. So that was really all I had to say today, but I'm here to answer any other questions you might have about the process and how we can be of assistance in the process.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us today to provide that overview, answer questions, and we appreciate your help as we are serving the Marylanders with historic buildings. It's really kind of our goal to help demystify this process as best we can and provide the resources and support you need as you seek the exemptions for your buildings. And that kind of will bring me into the next part of of the presentation in a moment. Which is going to be, feedback request. We're asking for your feedback before January 15th. You can get to it with this QR code, or we'll drop the link in the chat. So it's basically just a copy of everything you saw today, those forms, and some free response space. So we welcome your feedback and any additional information you might have. If there's other folks that you want to share it with, feel free. This will post on the YouTube page shortly. And that will also be available for anybody else that might have missed a session that is you think might benefit from seeing it. And I just wanted to kind of put out to you as we think about the next session for this. Some of this will be coming to just kind of reviewing any changes we've made, but also starting to think about that guidance for buildings for historic buildings in general that are trying to be more energy efficient. And so the idea as we get into that is to be grabbing the best information out there from folks. If you're at a county level and you work on this every day, we want to bring you into that process to help us collect the best guidance for all buildings that might be trying to meet both historic preservation goals while also being energy efficient. Because even for exempt buildings, just because you're exempt doesn't mean you can't start moving in the direction, and you're welcome to voluntarily benchmark too. We welcome all buildings, but for those that are exempt because of the requirements that are in the regulation, that's we can't say you have to meet these standards or you have to benchmark, but we want to encourage every building in the state to start moving in this direction. And so one of the things we want to do is really start putting together some good guidance for those buildings and draw on the great expertise that is around the state on these buildings, and especially to Elizabeth from MHT and the kind of folks that she works with, and the folks that work for the National Park Service and others kind of focusing on this. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sam, and then we'll probably get into Q&A shortly here. But thank you again for all joining us this morning.
Thank you, Zach. And thank you, Elizabeth, for that great overview. All right. So as Zach mentioned, we released a feedback form for you all today regarding the exemption applications for the historic property exemption. And so we dropped that in the chat. As Zach said, you can also use the QR code on the screen, but we'd really appreciate your feedback by mid-January, the 15th of 2025, almost the new year. So moving along, only a couple more slides. So next session of this historic property working group will be in early 2025. So we just ask that you stay tuned into the sign up form, which is on the QR. You can get to via the QR code on the screen. We also dropped that in the chat. But if you just express your interest in any of the working groups that are listed, we'll make sure to get emails out to those that are interested regarding upcoming sessions and access links for those sessions. So that form is where you need to go to see what we're hosting and get relevant information. So, and with that, thank you all for attending. Yes, as Zach just dropped in the chat, if you've signed up for this session, we believe you're interested in the Historic Property Working Group, and so we will email you all when the next session is scheduled. So with that, thanks for attending this first session of the Historic Property Working Group. There's some contact info for the building decarbonization team on the screen if you have any questions regarding BEPS or the exemption process. So beps.mde@maryland.gov, that's our email, or you can give us a call at 410-537-3183. And there's some QR codes on the screen for some extra resources. And before we get into Q&A, just want to say again, this will be uploaded to the BEPS YouTube playlist, so you can view it at a later date and find any of the links we've dropped in the chat in the video description when it's uploaded. And we will ping you all when that video is ready for viewing. So stay tuned to that. And we'd also recommend scrolling through the BEPS YouTube playlist and finding any videos that are relevant for you. They go into pretty good detail. So that's a great starting point for learning about BEPS if you're just getting started with it. So with that, let's move into Q&A for today. And I know some people joined a little late. And so if you missed initial instructions on the Q&A, the chat's disabled. So if you want to submit a question, the Q&A features in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. There's a button labeled Activities. It's a circle, triangle, square. You can click on that button, and there's a Q&A feature listed in there. So submit your questions to us via that tool. And if we can't get to your questions today, I will work to address them in future sessions. So without further ado, let's see what's coming in. Okay. So I think this would be a good question for Zach. Zach, we got a question that says, if an exemption is filed, is it a blanket exemption for the project, or is there a threshold for perhaps a less stringent EUI? In some cases, for instance, an envelope improvement could be developed, but enhancing window performance may not be met within the parameters of retaining historic profile. Do you think you could highlight parts of that question for us?
Yes, absolutely. This is a great question. So, and maybe just a little bit of background for everyone tuning in. Within the Climate Solutions Now Act that called for BEPS, the state legislature put in a couple of specific exemption categories of buildings that needed to be exempt, including historic buildings. And so the department determined, as in the rulemaking, that those buildings, based on the legislature, those buildings are completely exempt. They do not have to meet the benchmarking requirements. The ones that are, that have applied now and are determined to actually meet the criteria for being individually listed as a historic building, those buildings are completely exempt. They do not have to benchmark. They do not have to meet as currently in the regulation, the direct greenhouse gas emission standards. So these buildings are completely exempt. Now, again, as I said before, we encourage you to leverage. So as Sam just put it up, all these slides that's kind of in the yellow box, the total exemptions. All of those buildings are the ones that would be exempt, completely from any of the requirements in the regulation once they have applied and been determined to meet the exemption criteria. And so at that point, once you've submitted an exemption application and it's been approved, you're done. Again, from our standpoint, it would be great if you use this opportunity to start benchmarking anyway. Use all the resources we're providing to help explain how to benchmark and how you can understand this to benchmark and start thinking about how your building's performing in general, even if it is a historic building. And same goes for the resources and the tax credit Elizabeth was talking about before, right? If there's resources available to help you rehabilitate your building, thinking about energy use as you do it is a great idea. And that's this guidance that we're going to be working on through this working group will ultimately be trying to help support that, specifically to the what was asked in this question, right? Maybe as you're doing it, you've got a historic building, you say, well, hey, I can make some improvements to the envelope as I'm doing this. That's going to reduce my emissions. I'm exempt, but I still want to do this. That's going to reduce my emissions. It's also going to save me money, probably. In especially envelope work is usually very cost effective for most buildings, and so that's something where I say this is a good idea as we're already doing rehabilitation work to this building. And sure, say windows, that's too complicated to if we wanted to preserve the historic character and of that building. And so and that's fine, and that's kind of the goal with this guidance as we do it. And the second phase of this working group is trying to help provide that framework for these buildings that may not have any regulatory requirements, but may still benefit from moving in this direction of being more efficient and reducing their emissions. Hope that answers your question. And thank you for joining us and asking.
Thank you, Zach. And thank you for that question. And that's the only question we've received in the Q&A so far. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit them in there. But if that's all the questions for today. So again, thank you all for attending this Historic Property Working Group Session 1. We will email you all when the YouTube or the video is uploaded to YouTube along with all of the materials, and also let you know when Session 2 is scheduled. So just want to thank you all again for attending, and thank you to Elizabeth and Zach for your wisdom and information. So thank you all, and we'll see you in 2025. Hope you have a lovely holiday, and Happy New Year.